the internet's privacy crowd?
Well, that question's pretty easy. I'm unemployed and I got nothing better to do.
So you pulled the plug on the service in early August, but this wasn't a one-week discussion. This came after months and months of sort of the back and forth. Maybe I could even call it negotiation with the feds. Can we go through a chronology of this? When did they first contact you and say, we want X? And X eventually became SSL encryption keys, your private keys, but Edward Snowden was outed as a source of the leaks in late May, early June. So when did they first contact you about this?
Ladar Levison.
They first contacted me in May,
of Lavabit.
but the folks in Dallas that I actually spoke to didn't know themselves at that time who the subject of the investigation was. And since there were multiple investigations going on simultaneously into completely different users for completely different things, I can't say with any certainty that initial meeting had anything to do with what ended up becoming the demand for my SSL keys. That timeline...
They were the same folks in these different meetings? If it's Agent Smith, consistently across multiple months, we can make an educated guess.
Well, that's just it. The agents that I interfaced with in Dallas were always acting at the behest of other agents operating out of the Washington, D.C. field office. So the faces that I met, that didn't mean anything, because they could have been operating on behalf of different people. I interfaced with two different sets of agents. It's interesting that they swapped them out when I decided to take the matter to court. I don't know if that had anything to do with it or not.
So the initial contact in May was before, let's say before Snowden's identity became public, was what? What did they want? They just wanted to chat. They wanted what? They always want something.
Yes, they always want something. I thought they figured I was a nice guy and they wanted to meet me.
You're not that nice of a guy. I'm sorry. It's really important.
Sometimes the truth hurts. What they claimed is that they wanted to streamline the process of serving me subpoenas for information. And they wanted to entice me into enrolling in InfraGard, which is the organization that sort of acts as an intermediary when it comes to collaborating private industry and law enforcement. When they showed up, they added in, oh, and we want to ask you a few questions so we can conduct a background check and get you a security clearance. Thought that was interesting. Never needed a security clearance before just to be served documents. But that was what it was about. And, they said we thought something was coming down the line. We don't know what. They won't even tell us what. But we wanted to get some of this stuff out of the way so that we can act upon it quickly when the time comes.
Now let's skip ahead to the next phase. The next phase was once the Edward Snowden-related Lavabit account became public, and then what happened next?
Well, there were a few steps in between. And I'm trying to think off the top of my head because I think some of these documents weren't unsealed.
That's what okay, nobody tell anyone outside this room. It's just between you and 100 or so of us.
But let's just say some of the precursor documents were served to me right around the time that The Guardian revealed that Edward Snowden was leaking documents. Not to say that these documents had anything to do with Edward Snowden, of course, but just a happy coincidence. And of course, I didn't hear anything back on the matter until June 29th. So if we're going to start a timeline with any precision, that would be the date to remember.
And what was memorable about that date?
I got a knock on my door, unannounced and unanticipated, and on the other side.
Your home?
This was my home office, yeah.
It wasn't at 4:30 in the morning.
No, it was about 6 p.m. And I was actually getting ready to head out the door, but they didn't seem to be bothered by that at all. And of course, I thought it was just the apartment complex stopping by to drop off some packages. do around that time. So I opened the door without checking the people. You know, usually when somebody wants to get into my building, they have to ring through a gate system, and I let them in. So the only people who can knock on my door directly are people in the building already. Well, apparently the FBI doesn't have to go through that process. They get to show their badges to the leasing office and walk right up. So much for security. But I opened the door, and there were the two FBI agents that had approached me in May. And they said, well, we think that, I'm trying to remember exactly what they said, but they basically said that they had a court order that was about to arrive and they wanted to serve it to me. And within a minute or two, his BlackBerry started buzzing, and he said, oh, it's here, let me just forward this to you.
What are your email address?
Well, they already had my email address. I think they wanted to be able to tell me what the court order was telling me to do before I had actually got the chance to read it.
Or talk to a lawyer.
Certainly talk to a lawyer, but at the time I didn't realize I needed a lawyer. Because at the time I didn't realize that they were going to ask for my SSL keys.
And that order, in late June, that's a court order signed by a judge, right? That one.
That was a court order signed by a judge, and this was one of the documents that was unsealed. It was the order for a pen track and trace device. And you can think of this as a little black box that historically would have hung on the telephone pole outside of the suspect's house. And it would have gathered all of the telephone numbers that they dialed and how long they spoke. Well, the modern version looks more like a computer and sits in a rack. And as we now know, decrypts all of the communications coming in and out of the network or server, and similarly filters and records whatever information has been set up. You know,
the reason they use pen registers in combination with trap and trace orders is so they get both the numbers that you're calling and the numbers that call you, or in the internet, and this was explained to the internet, through a bunch of mechanisms starting with the 1994 Ladar law. It's also the IP addresses, the email addresses, both to and from.
Yeah, well, they certainly modified it when computers came into play. And if you read one of these documents, it basically authorizes them to collect anything and everything that we might consider to be native.
So everything but content.
Everything but content.
And so
of course that's relative, right? Because it collects all of the email headers except the subject one. And as we all know, oftentimes the subject can be duplicated in other headers. So effectively, everything that's in a header it collects.
Everything but the body. Okay, so
But it also includes login, log out, date and time, and where they were logging in from. And if these three pieces of information are important because they're effectively the only three pieces of information that they needed to decrypt all the communications for.
So that wanted, but did that June 29th, I think you said, 28th order, court order signed by a judge, Henry's traffic trace order, did that request your private SSL encryption keys, the master keys to your web server?
Depends on who you ask.
I'm asking you.
The FBI agents told me it did.
Was it that? Did it actually say that in the court order?
It did not. But you have to remember, when I'm going through this meeting, I hadn't had a chance to read the order. So I was relying upon the agent's interpretation of it. And what they told me was that it required me to hand over my SSL keys, give them access to install this black box on my network, and that I couldn't tell anybody that this was going on. And then they continued on to say that they were going to be collecting content, and more importantly, passwords, because they wanted
on an ongoing basis, not just historical, but future.
For as long as the order was authorized, which was 60 days.
With the possibility
of renewal, of course. And unless they happen to catch the particular suspect, you could pretty much assume that the renewals would have been indefinite. So they were effectively asking me to open up my network to them and allow them to peek at everything coming in and out of it, decrypt it, and do that on an ongoing basis for an indefinite period of time, and that I would have to remain secret indefinitely. The important thing to remember about the laws regarding sealing of these orders is that they don't automatically expire. You have to go back to the judge and ask for permission to talk about it, which is somewhat ridiculous.
Well, let me get back to that later. Well, let's just continue the chronology. They said that this order, ambiguous, perhaps applies to SSL keys, and then you eventually had a chance to take a look at it before to your email address. Well, and then you probably maybe talked to a lawyer then, and then you said, uh-oh, wait, hold on.
Yeah, it wasn't until an hour and a half into the conversation that they explicitly stated we want your SSL keys. But when that topic came up, I said, well, I think if that's what the order says, I certainly need to read it and probably consult an attorney first. And they said, well, certainly, you should consult an attorney. And of course, this discussion went on and lasted 2.5, maybe 3 hours. So when they finally left, I actually didn't go read my email. I went out and enjoyed my Friday night. Or at least what was left of it.
And then eventually you had a chance to look at this, take some time.
It gets better. Well, it gets better because Monday morning, I finally signed on to my computer and I get the email that had been forwarded to me on Friday. And right on its heels was another email. Apparently, as soon as they had left my apartment without these keys, they had petitioned the judge for an order to compel, effectively telling the judge that I was unwilling to comply with the order and was being obstinate and sought remedy from the court. And I thought, well, that's a little bit strange because I told them they could install the device. I just said I wasn't going to give them the SSL keys. And in the order to compel, it said I was required to provide them with all the necessary technical assistance. Well, tell me, does technical assistance mean SSL keys?
Well, we're going to ask Kurt that when it comes up, but that is language in the statute. But I spent the better part of a week this summer looking into this for CNET and talking to a bunch of lawyers and never found a good case on point. I don't know. Let's continue with the chronology. We're now in we're now at that Monday. When did you eventually lawyer up?
Well, when I got the order to compel, I emailed them back and said, you know what, guys? I think you quoted me out of context in your motion. So I think from this point forward, we should probably conduct all of the questioning and all of the collaboration in writing, via email, at least until I'm able to retain an attorney.
You must have loved that.
I'm sure they did, but of course they never emailed me to say, well, what, oh, and I also asked them in that very same email, quote, what exactly do you mean by technical assistance? Hoping that they would email me back and say, we want your SSL keys. Because by this time, I had looked in both documents and there was no mention of SSL. There was no mention of private encryption keys, which are obviously very sensitive pieces of information and presumably would be detailed out if the court wanted me to turn them over. They never emailed me back to ask for those SSL keys. I think the last thing they wanted was to put that request in writing. Because then I would have a document, even under seal, that I could show to others and prove that this is what they were doing to companies like mine in order to conduct this type of surveillance.
But eventually, they did put it in writing.
They did. The timeline continues. And of course, they never contacted me about installing their device. Instead, I ended up contacting the EFF, and they eventually linked me up with a former staff attorney based out of San Francisco. And I finally got linked up with her the following
That will
Monday.
be Marsha Hoffman.
Marsha Hoffman, yeah. Shout out to her, since she's still on the legal team. I finally made it to San Francisco, and of course she's in Germany. But I got linked up with her Monday night, and she was interested in helping me on the case. I regrouped with her Tuesday morning and hung up the phone to go email her the documents that I had been received or served with, and I got another knock on my door.
So wait, you were about to email her, or you did email her the documents? Or was the knock?
Doesn't matter.
No, it was the knock on the door in response to the email. They said, "We noticed you've been
No,
emailing."
the knock on the door had nothing to do with me sending that
Okay,
email.
then what was the knock on the door for this time?
You cut me off.
I'm sorry. I couldn't help
And
myself.
we'll be right back after these messages. The knock on the door was a new set of federal agents that had showed up to serve me with a summons. And basically what the summons said was, you're not complying with this pen traffic trace order. You need to show up in Washington, D.C. next week, as in 7 days from now, and explain to a judge why you're not cooperating. At your own expense, of course. Well, that was a little bit disturbing, particularly since I had agreed to let them install this pen traffic trace device on my network. All I had refused to do was give them the SSL keys. But I got back on the phone with Marsha, and I explained that to her, and unfortunately, she couldn't help me on a case in Virginia, being in San Francisco pro bono in a week's time. So that sort of prompted the scramble to retain counsel 1,000 miles away from where I typically conducted business. But the process goes on. She did help me in a conference call the following day, and it was at that point that I discussed the issue with some of the Department of Justice attorneys. And it was also the first time that somebody else was in the room or virtually on the phone, Marsha, and they reiterated at that point the request for the SSL keys. But what they also did, and Marsha had explained this to me the day before, was clarify that all they really were after, at least legally speaking, was the metadata. As in information that would normally be contained on a server, in a server's log files. Now, of course, when I had designed my service and built the system from scratch, I didn't put in code to log any of this information because I didn't want to be forced to turn it over as a result of an NSL. So I figured if I don't have it, I can't turn it over. But here they had a duly authorized order of the court demanding this information. So at least philosophically speaking, I was willing to add the necessary logic to log this information off and saw it as the better alternative than shutting down the service and depriving 400,000 people of access to their email. They came back and said, well, even if you sent these log files to us once a day, it wouldn't be fast enough. We want it in real time. And I'm thinking, well, what you really want is the ability to log into a device on my network and change the parameters it's using to collect information in real time. But the process continued, and of course, I realized at that point that I would have to show up in Washington, D.C. or risk having a warrant issued for my arrest. It's always a fun decision, right? But they were nice. That Thursday, they served me with another subpoena. Again, another knock at my door. Actually, this one was a little bit different. This was the one where I supposedly snuck out the back door of my 5th floor apartment.
Fire escape?
Yeah, no fire escape, folks. I do have a small 8-foot by 5-foot patio overlooking the pool. And I guess if I had a 50-yard rope, I could have shimmied down to the pool. Nope, I exited my front door and took the elevator down to my car and drove out of the apartment complex the same way I always do. But this time it was a little bit different because I happened to notice a gray Ford Escort following me. That was a little bit awkward. I tend to get a little bit nervous when, an unmarked vehicle starts tailing me. And I'm left with the difficult choice of how do I look up the location of the closest police station while continuing to drive my vehicle safely?
Siri.
You must have an iPhone. I have an Android. And it doesn't seem to understand what I say, so I do it the old-fashioned way. I've got one of those phones with a physical keyboard, just because. But fortunately, I was able to shake my tail on the 5th try before I was able to look up the police station. But I thought that was a little bit awkward. Later that day, I started getting text messages from some friends of mine that said some FBI agents were showing up and showing a photo of me to them and asking if they had seen me recently. I was starting to develop quite the reputation. The girls in the leasing office had been visited by the FBI enough times that I thought they were starting to think that I was a mob boss.
Or maybe just an informant.
Well, I found out later that they thought I was a mob boss who was about to become an informant. Of course, all my friends weren't quite so nice. They thought I was some sort of escaped convict, which of course made everything awkward. But eventually, they did catch up to me at my apartment complex when I got home. They were ready and waiting for me, and served me with a subpoena. Quote, they were trying to be nice. Apparently, if the Department of Justice serves you with a subpoena, they can pay for your travel. So when I had stipulated I can't afford a last-minute fare to Washington, D.C., hotel, cab fares, and everything else, I didn't have an extra $2-3 grand for that in the budget, not to mention the fact that I was still trying to afford an attorney. They decided, well, we'll just give him a subpoena so we can pay for his travel.
You get something like $24 a day per diem. So.
They're very generous. They want to take care of their snitches, which I guess is effectively what they were trying to turn me into. But this subpoena is significant because it was also the first time that I had a document in writing which explicitly stated the demand for the SSL fees. And it's one of 2 documents that is currently on appeal. The process continues, and I spend all of the available time the next 3 days interviewing attorneys. And Marcia was very helpful with this, along with several other people, in giving me names of people who were local to the Alexandria Court in Virginia, where I had to appear. The problem was, all the ones I could afford were criminal defense attorneys. Do you know what the primary objective of a criminal defense attorney is?
Get a good plea bargain.
I was going to say to keep you out of jail. Folks, I wasn't the one they wanted to throw in jail. So that made it somewhat awkward when I'm talking to a criminal defense attorney and he's telling me, well, just give them what you want. You won't have to go to jail. Like, you're missing the point. I need an attorney so I don't have to give them what they want. Well, unfortunately, I wasn't able to find an attorney in the amount of time I was given, at least one that I could afford, because of the half dozen or so people that I was able to get in contact and interview with. Only one of them really understood the issues, and that was because he specialized in the area and represented large ISPs as his main, business. Generally in the FISA court, but I figured he could slum it in federal district court. The problem was he wanted $500 an hour. I couldn't afford that. So I had to keep looking, and like I said, the search continued. I ended up contacting the federal public defender's office for that courthouse. And without giving him too many details, explained to him the situation and asked if he could help out and at least appear on my behalf and do anything that was possible to help out. And I said the primary thing I think I need at this point is a continuance. And he offered to contact the Department of Justice on my behalf and see if they would grant a continuance. Well, I got a call back shortly after that. He said, sorry, I can't help you. There's a conflict of interest. Apparently, you can only fight the government so many times before eventually you end up with a conflict of interest. And I think Kurt can talk about that a little bit more, because at least the running theory is part of the reason the EFF couldn't help me out on this particular issue is because they're suing the federal government on so many other fronts already. They didn't want to end up in a conflict of interest situation, in which case ethics rules dictate that they would have had to remove themselves or recuse themselves from both cases.
Well, let me ask Kurt about that, but moving ahead.
Just foreshadowing.
You did not find an attorney that could help, that's able, that's admitted to the bar, able to practice law in Virginia.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. I spoke to several attorneys that I knew in the Dallas area, but of course they had the same problem as Marcia. They weren't members of the Alexandria, Virginia court. It's an exclusive little club that you need to be a member of if you want to represent somebody. So the process continued, and of course I wasn't able to find somebody in time and had to appear alone and represent myself.
So you showed up in D.C. Or in Virginia.